Today, April 4th, marks the 49th anniversary of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, killed in 1968. It's also the 50th anniversary of his Beyond Vietnam speech, which he delivered from the altar of Riverside Church in New York. In it, he condemned the Vietnam War, a move seen at the time to be political suicide.
Calling to speak is often a vocation of agony, but we must speak. We must speak with all the humility that is appropriate to our limited vision, but we must speak.
He says he was called to speak, though it meant harming his relationship with the president. Called to speak, though it would hurt his public support and, in the minds of some, his civil rights mission. He was heavily criticized afterward, told he should have essentially stayed in his lane. Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler of Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ joins me on this historic anniversary. Reverend, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
In his Beyond Vietnam speech, the Reverend spoke about it being the first time in history that religious leaders were actually standing up in dissent, saying it was based on the mandates of conscience and the readings of history. How has history treated this speech 50 years later? Well,
I think by and large, the history has ignored the speech. I mean, we go to basically the easier things like the I Have a Dream speech, and we forget about the serious analysis that took place on April 4th, 1967 at the Riverside Church that basically called us to understand that there was a relationship between going to war and maintaining a war and being able to service your communities at home in terms of alleviating poverty, in terms of all the other kinds of social programs that takes people from the margins and give them opportunity and hope. And basically, you know, his argument was that the issue around civil rights had been shot down on the battlefields of Vietnam because money and resources and energy was heading that way. But he also cautioned us that unless we step out and stand up against wars, we were going to be marching against wars happening in different places for years to come. And, you know, he mentions Mozambique, he mentions South Africa, he mentions a whole lot of other places. And of course, that has come true. That fate had come true. And so again, you know, we're reminded at this time that those words are still so very relevant, because here we are, 2017, talking about building up the military again, talking about cutting all the kinds of social programs that are in existence to expand the military so that the military will get more money than it ever has gotten in history. And so again, it's the kind of pulling away from local resources to fund a standing army.
He was so heavily criticized at that time, though, when he made that speech. He was lambasted by the Washington Post, the New York Times editorial boards for making the connection between war and civil rights. As I said, essentially, he was told he should have stayed in his lane and that it was political suicide for him to veer off of that. Would the same be said today?
Well, I think that the same is being said in many ways today, because just look at the sort of the very right-wing religious agenda. Basically goes forth and it beats the drums of warfare and conquest and all of those. And then on the other side, you have those who are talking about peace and justice and really evaluating where we are, not only as a nation, but as a world, and that we need to step back from this periphery of violence and begin to live and approach life and the world in a different way. We're afraid of each other also. We're afraid of people from the United States. We're afraid of people in other parts of the world. We're afraid of refugees. We're afraid of immigrants. You name it, we're afraid of that because we have not, in a sense, engaged people in a way that makes people human.
It sounds like, though, you're saying that he was never vindicated for his comments, that his comments in the Beyond Vietnam speech were never truly accepted. If 50 years later we're still continuing the same thought process.
We're still continuing the same process. And understand, at the time when he made the speech, it was considered un-American, that he had given aid to the communists,
right.
and he had undermined the war effort and all of those types of things. But what the reality is, we had a disproportionate number of minorities and poor folks dying on the battlefields of Vietnam. One of the things that he says that he got confronted in the cities where riots and disturbances had taken place. And people said, well, how can you talk to us about nonviolence when you got America engaged in this very violent situation in Southeast Asia? And so he looked at it and he said, there's a contradiction. There's a contradiction for me to be speaking about nonviolence, but at the same time remaining silent about what is going on in Vietnam. And that it was really, it glared to him as hypocrisy. And therefore he felt compelled to speak out against war abroad and clearly the violence that was taking place at home.
I want to move on to the anniversary of his assassination, obviously on the same day. The FBI tweeted today, as they do on anniversaries of his assassination, that it honors the life, work, and commitment of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to justice. But we know the way that the FBI treated the Reverend when he was alive was much different than what that tweet encapsulates.
Right. I mean, it was a matter of they thought that King and the movement were stooges of the Soviet Union in those days. That somehow they had been funded and manipulated by communists and socialists worldwide in order to create the kinds of dissension and disturbances that was going on in the U.S., as if somehow people who are oppressed need somebody else to direct their feelings. And so, again, so the FBI, obviously, they bugged them, they hounded them. They carried on what we know as COINTELPRO, which was counterintelligence, to basically try to create dissension in the households, just dissension in the movement, and all those kinds of things. And it should not be lost on anybody, because some of us have lived long enough to have suspicious minds. April 4th, 1967, he breaks the silence on Vietnam. April 4th, 1968, he is assassinated. One has to look at it and see the symbolism of that, but not the symbolism of that in somehow a benevolent way, but the symbolism of that in terms that somebody, somewhere, was trying to deliver a message.
We have less than a minute left, but I want to ask you, he was very concerned about making conditions better for the United States. Do you see current leaders in today's time that are vowing to do the same?
No, not really. I mean, because what we're looking at in the U.S., we're looking at what we call right or left politics, or what we call liberal or conservative politics. And folks are really addressing at this point their own political needs. When we got all this problem that's going on, I mean, the fact is that folks tried to deal with taking away health care just recently in the U.S. Congress. But it opens the door for us to make another prophetic call, and that call is that we need to move towards universal health care and push even further, push even harder. That's what social justice is about. That's what we're called to do when we look at the society and look at what's lacking and respond to King's speech today in 2017.
Thank you so much, Reverend Graylin Scott Hagler, Plymouth Congregational United Church of Christ. We really appreciate you coming on today.